Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Naya Hyde. We're so happy you could join us. I'm a marketing assistant for the K through 12 education products here at Brooks Publishing. And before we start, I just like to go over a few housekeeping items. Next slide, please. Perfect. You'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please be sure to type them into the question box. We'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A portion of the webinar. For the presentation, you might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, you can do that by just clicking the orange button once again. If you experience any audio issues at any point, you can switch to phone by clicking the audio section of the webinar panel and using the dial-in information provided. Also, we are recording this webinar, so everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. We can head over to the next slide. Just before we start the presentation, we just want to start with a small poll to get to know our audience better. So let's open that up. And just to answer which best describes you, we'll let that run for a little bit. Awesome. Super awesome. All right, let's close the poll and kind of go over what everyone answered. So we have about 16% of you who say you are a speech language pathologist, 38% early childhood educator, 4% behavioral interventionist, 1% general educators, and 41% of you selected others. So that's awesome. We really thank you for joining us today, and we really hope you enjoyed the presentation. All right. Perfect. During today's presentation, Patricia Prelock will reference content from Treatment of Autism Spectrum Disorder, Evidence-Based Intervention Strategies for Communication and Social Interactions, the second edition. A little bit about the book. So, to work effectively with individuals who have autism spectrum disorder, SLPs, and other practitioners need in-depth knowledge on choosing and implementing interventions for communication and social challenges. The second edition of this best-selling textbook gives professionals the foundation they need to evaluate and compare today's widely used interventions and determine which ones will best promote the outcomes for the people they serve. To learn more about the book, you can visit that URL that is shown on your screen. Next slide, please. We are also happy to announce that Brooks will be giving away 3 copies of Treatment of Autism Spectrum Disorder, the second edition. Winners will be randomly selected from today's live attendees and notified by email after the webinar. So to increase your chances, be sure to submit your questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. And then we'll head over to the next slide. Also, we did want to mention that at the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a short survey. We would love to know what you thought of the webinar, and anyone who completes the survey will also be entered to win a copy of the book. So definitely fill that out at the end. Then we can head over to the next slide. And then everyone watching this webinar, you will be able to download a certificate of attendance. For those of you who are watching this live, you can download your certificate from the handouts pane. Live attendees will also be emailed their certificate in the next 24 hours. And for those of you who are watching this webinar as a recording, stay tuned to the end of today's webinar presentation to learn more about how to access your certificate. Without further delay, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Patricia Prelock is Provost and Senior Vice President at the University of Vermont, formerly the Dean of the College of Nursing and Health Sciences at the University of Vermont for 10 years. She is also Professor of Communication Sciences and Disorders and Professor of Pediatrics in the College of Medicine at the University of Vermont. Dr. Prelock studies the nature and treatment of autism spectrum disorder with specific focus on theory of mind and the development of interventions to support social cognition by using a family-centered approach. She is board-certified specialist in child language, a University of Vermont scholar, an ASHA fellow and honoree, and a fellow in the National Academies of Practice in Speech Language Pathology. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're so excited for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Nia, for this opportunity, and thank you for Brooks to helping us achieve our goals for giving some good content to our community around autism spectrum disorders and treatment through case studies. And I want to thank my colleague, Rebecca McCulley, who has worked closely with me on both of these publications. So today, what I thought I would do is just share with you some of the categories of the intervention chapter so you have a sense of what is happening and what you might learn, and then to walk you through our approach to case studies, and then go through one example of a case study that is specifically around a young school-age child who has some social skills challenges. So as you look at the book, we have tried to pull interventions that are highly popular, are identified in the National Standards Project as evidence-based or emerging interventions that will lead to change in social communication and social interaction. But I thought it might be helpful for you to kind of see, I was thinking about it and realizing that there are some ways that I might be able to categorize some of the interventions so you get a sense of what you're going to be reading about, and I'm sure what you've heard. So there are at least 3 intervention models that are described in the book, and when I suggest an intervention model, it usually means that it's no one specific strategy, but it's a host of strategies that are built together in a framework. So the Early Start Denver model is an example of one, and it's very appropriate for our youngest children with autism. And it really, it was developed by Sally Rogers and Jerry Dawson, and Jerry is one of the key authors for this. And what they do is have an assessment process and checklist, and then a program for instructions and activities, and they use both naturalistic pieces, but also discrete trial kinds of activities and pivotal response activities like choice and motivation, motivating materials, and then some of their own strategies for instruction. It's generally intended for kids 12 to 48 months. Not as appropriate for older kids, and they really focus on things like imitation, verbal and nonverbal communication. And so it's a model that looks at multiple strategies to support the development of skills in kids with autism. Another favorite model for me is the Jasper model that comes from Connie Casseri's work. And it really looks at joint attention, symbolic play, and emotion regulation. And so there's multiple strategies, again, that Connie and her team have talked about, and she is also one of the authors, where they really talk about setting up an environment that really allows a child to engage in a joint activity, to really establish routines and facilitating and maintaining a connection with another person and helping kids to regulate. And so they use both behavioral approaches and more social pragmatic approaches to support the symbolic play pieces. So again, using multiple intervention strategies that we'll talk about in the later chapters. And then the CERTS model also builds on the concept of emotion regulation and social communication. But what they add that is unique, and Barry Prezant, who is the developer of that model with his colleagues, really talk about transactional supports, which really helps not only the families, but also the providers who are supporting kids who have autism. So Early Start Denver, Jasper, mainly for younger kids. The CERTS model has been used for younger as well as school-age children. And all of them are using multiple skill-based and relationship-based interventions. So then you'll see a whole host of skill-based interventions. And what I mean by that is that those interventions are specifically designed to improve an individual's ability to say something or interact or perform a particular task. So there's a wonderful chapter by Jane Wagner who talks about a whole host of augmentative communication strategies, including picture exchange communication, which is highly popular, as well as voice output and low-tech and high-tech approaches. And then Susan Zwisniewski has done, who's kind of an expert in the DTI model really, and her colleagues talk about some of those more discrete trial things that are important for early attention and understanding of word association and connection that will then help us move to more relationship-based and cognitive-based. And then Mark Duran is talking about functional communication training and an early start for how to determine, for those who have more minimal communication skills, how can we make sure that the skills that they have are really going to lead to functional change. And then we have Ann Kaiser and her colleagues talking about enhanced milieu teaching, which is really looking at a more naturalistic approach in the natural milieu or the environment. But how do you take kids who are at the early word language development and support their development of communication and natural context? And then Lynn Cagle and her colleagues who've developed the pivotal response treatment, which is a nice contemporary approach to intervention where it brings in the best of behavioral approaches and the best of social communication approaches and looks at how do you facilitate social interaction and social communication by looking at things that motivate children to perform, that give kids choices, that really lead to reinforcement that is actually meaningful. And then Tom Buggy talks about video modeling, both video modeling of someone who's performing an action to really support a child or an adolescent or an adult's ability to perform a particular act, whether it's a communication, social interaction, or even an adaptive behavior skill, as well as video self-modeling, where you actually videotape the child or the individual performing an activity to reinforce their skill set. And then we have a couple of interventions that clearly develop skills, but they're more designed to develop relationships with children. So a popular one that is used that was developed by Stanley Greenspan and Serena Weider, which Sima Gerber has developed for us, is the developmental individual difference relationship-based model, which really looks at all the language components, but is based on how to move a child socially, emotionally through their milestone ladders. And of course, using a strategy that's a favorite of mine, and that's floor time, where you really are developing attachments and connections with children. And it really starts with families. And then the early social interaction model that was developed by our colleagues, Amy Weatherby and Julianne Woods, who talk about a model using with parents to really develop early connections for our youngest population. And then the more cognitive-based interventions in the book are those that really require children to think and problem solve and know that there's a certain behavior that you want. They come to the table with a certain ability or skill set, and how do we give them the cognitive strategies with other supports? And so peer mediation, Eric Carter and his colleagues have done a lot of work in this, and although they definitely use behavioral strategies, they really use peers to help support positive interaction. But it really requires some thinking and questioning and understanding how your peer is feeling in the situation and how you might engage. And then there are a host of social skills interventions, and this is a new chapter that we added. And actually, the Early Start Denver model was a new one that we added, and the CERTS model. And the social skills intervention has just now shown some additional evidence for a variety of social skills programs. And so we've highlighted several of those that were manualized so that it's easier for the clinician, teacher, individual who's working with a child or adolescent with autism to actually implement it. And it really does require skill, knowledge, and then the ability to think about how you would act in a particular environment. And then last, another favorite of mine is the social stories. My colleague Tiffany Hutchins wrote about this, and it comes from Carol Gray's work, but really looking at how do you create short stories that really are truly cognitively based and have more thinking sentences in them so that children and adolescents that you use it with can actually think about the perspective of another person. So that kind of gives you a sense of kind of the categories. And then I tried to put for you here just which ones really focus on social communication or communication. It doesn't mean that they don't do social interaction, but their primary focus is social communication. And then those that really fit into the social interaction, interpersonal kind of connection. And then those interventions in the book that really speak to both, that really can be designed to support both social communication and social interaction. So one of the new things that we've added with our companion book is the case studies, and each of the case studies match all the interventions that I just spoke about. So as I went through each of those interventions, you will actually have a case study that describes, it gives an introduction of the individual, whether it's a young child, a school-age child, adolescent, that what their history is, and some baseline status. So what does their communication or social interaction profiles look like? What does their family context or community context look like, and how will they be supported in your intervention approaches? And then a more broad profile, which really looks at, are there any sensory issues that we should be concerned about? What are the medical and behavioral issues? So for each chapter, the writers of those chapters actually responded to those elements. And then there's a section on assessment for communication that will lead to treatment planning. So and in that section, we really look for receptive and expressive language information. There's cognitive information provided in terms of intellectual capacity and understanding, what kinds of communication modalities the individual with autism is demonstrating, how is their social communication working, or is that an area of significant challenge? And then, of course, we look at the big 9 in speech pathology, so we always include, are there any fluency issues, any voice issues, problems with speech sound production like in articulation, is there any hearing loss, and any swallowing challenges. And then what each case study does is it looks at how are we going to look at the information that we got? Do we understand what the history of the individual is? Here's all the information we have, and the assessment is really going to help us determine treatment. So then we've asked our writers to talk about how are we going to then use this information to really engage in clinical problem solving so that we can develop treatment goals that are going to actually make a difference. And so we ask each of the authors to talk about what are the principles and values and those procedures that are really going to guide your approach. So for us, and a lot of the work that we do here at the university, family-centered principles, strength-based approaches, using an ability to think and problem solve. So cognitive opportunities to really ask questions and increase independence are going to be some of the principles that would be in my chapters. And then the next section is, okay, based on all of this information, how, if we've established these treatment goals, how are we going to plan for support? and what of the interventions make the most sense. Now, of course, each chapter is specifically designed to match the intervention that it is based on, but it does not mean that that is the only intervention that they will include, but they try and demonstrate how the Early Start Denver model, for example, might work in this context, or how a social skills intervention like skill streaming, which we'll talk about, might be the best approach for this particular child. Then the other things that we do is each case study also identifies what were the outcomes based on the intervention and how it led to change and expected change for the treatment goals that were designed. And then we have references in each of those so that if the reader wants to pursue looking at some of those references as they're building their own case for potentially using an intervention that has an evidence base for a particular case study. And then we also offer learning activities. And for those of you who are educators or are teaching in the classroom, we felt this was very helpful, as not only for our students, but to give them an opportunity to actually apply their learning, but also for those who are in practice, some professional development opportunities. So I thought I would just take you through a real quick look at one of the case study examples, and I picked the social skills intervention one because it was one that I wrote with Ashley Breen, who is one of our doctoral students here, who is doing work in this particular area. And it's about a young man named Link. And so as we looked at the history for this young man, he was diagnosed at age 3, but also had delayed language that sometimes occurs for kids with autism, sometimes does not, and some significant behavior challenges. And he had services from the time he was diagnosed. When we looked at some baseline data, he was given the SELF-5, and for those of you who are not speech pathologists, that's just the clinical evaluation of language functions. That really is a fundamental receptive and expressive language task so that we understand what his knowledge base is. Interestingly, he had fairly strong receptive and expressive vocabulary and fairly good language, pretty verbal kid. Yet he really lacked a lot of social awareness and was really being challenged by friends. And he would get extremely frustrated and angry and then have these behavioral outbursts where he would lash out with other individuals. So when we were trying to figure out for Link, how are we going to support him and how do we know that social skills intervention is really the best approach? So we did some additional assessment because our basic language assessment indicated, well, he had improved in his language, but clearly he's still not being successful in a social exchange. So 2 tools that my colleagues here, Tiffany Hutchins and I, have developed are the theory of mind inventory and the theory of mind task battery. The inventory is a parent informant measure and the task battery is a child measure. And we thought, let's give him those because it really looks at theory of mind, and that may be where Link is really being challenged and not being successful in his social interactions. And we found that he was performing below average, and considering his strong language and cognitive skills, that was a concern. And then we also did the social language development test, and interestingly, he was average on that. So it does say that, you know, sometimes our formalized measures don't always get at the core of what is challenging for a child with autism. We did also do the pragmatic language skills inventory, and he was below average. So we had a good sense, okay, he does lack social awareness in friends, and as we looked at his inventory, we could see there are just theory of mind skills that he has, but there are several at the more advanced level that we would expect for a 12-year-old to have that he just does not have and is getting him into trouble. So based on all the things that we learned from the assessment, we decided, okay, how are we going to address his needs and what will be some of the therapy goals that we want to achieve. And so one of the manualized social skills programs that is featured in this case study and in the book is the skills streaming approach. And many of our teachers may be very well aware of it. They have an early childhood, a school age, adolescent program. And they have a great checklist that looks at how a child is managing their anxiety and anger and disruption. So using that was very useful to us in developing some therapy goals. And then we really were looking at his social cognition challenges from a theory of mind perspective. And so we found that social common sense, his ability to really understand what is a common sense response in this particularly highly challenged friendship scenario. How does he respond? Usually not well, and so that's an area that we're going to have to develop for him. Verbal irony, he just didn't get some of the unusual things his friends would say. He was very structured in his thinking, and so the ability to think flexibly about how he might handle a situation. If he's playing a game with a friend and he's just so stuck on the rules and his friends want to change it up a bit, make it a little more interesting, that was hard for him, so that became a goal. And then really identifying what his thoughts are in comparison to the thoughts of his peers and how he might be feeling about a particular event or situation and what his friends feel about that. So those were the goal areas that we developed. And we really got that from doing a very careful assessment of theory of mind and his pragmatic language skills, and then the skills streaming checklist. And then we decided that we would use comic strip conversations. He seemed to like to draw, and it was a great way if he had an anger outburst to really comic strip it out, to really see, okay, what happened, making no judgment. Let's identify who was there, what did they say, what do you think they were thinking, what were you thinking, going through the whole process, and then identifying, okay, so what were the strategies that you could have used? And then if you use this strategy, what would have happened? This strategy, what would have happened? And then asking him to figure out, okay, if I was in this situation again, here's the first thing I could do. And if that doesn't work, here's the second thing I could do. And then the social stories for him, he was a reader. He also liked stories. And so creating stories that had thinking sentences that were around a theme, like what happens when things don't go your way, and it wouldn't have to necessarily be a specific event. That's what the comic strip would do, but a whole series of events so that he understands this is how generally people respond when things don't go their way, and here's how you could respond. And then we use the skill streaming, the elementary school child, so that we could work with him and his school, his educational program, and other students in the class to really support more positive engagement. And then the other interventions that we decided to do is that we felt group intervention is going to work best for him because he has to be able to connect this with his peers, since that is the population he's having the most difficulty with. And so in group intervention, you first define what is the skill you want them to learn, and then you model it. And then you establish why they need that skill. So you give them real scenarios and talk about real events in their life that would have been helpful if they had this skill. And then you select a role player to act out how this is going to happen. You conduct the role play, you give feedback in the group intervention, and then you give the kids some homework, and then you select the next role player, and you just keep going through that. And you can utilize some of the areas of social cognition that you're trying to develop. And just to give you a sense of Link's family history, what we did is, and you'll see in every case study, there is what we call a genogram, which is a family tree. So you can see where Link is. He's the oldest of 4 children, and who's in his family and who the parents can actually attribute some support for. And then the Eco Map is really an environmental scan on who is in his life and in his community. So there's educational and support services that he has. The darker the arrow, the stronger the relationship. The dotted arrow means it may be a new relationship. When the arrow goes back and forth, it means it's a mutually beneficial experience. And then we always like to do things in community sports, like who are their family friends that they can work with. Some families have churches or organizations. The primary care provider is important. And again, these are more tenuous relationships because they're newly established. So that's important as a provider to understand that. And then extended family. And you can see there are some tensions with the paternal grandfather. Part of that is not understanding Link as a young man who happens to have autism and not understanding his behavior, and can they count on him for support. So this kind of just gives you a sense of family context and environmental context, and every one of our case study chapters has these for each of the cases. And then for our friend Link, what we did was we were able to demonstrate positive outcomes for anger management for him following our skill streaming approach. And he was much more effective at engaging in reciprocal conversations, which was really a positive because that was the one thing that was really interfering with his ability to establish and maintain friendships. And that's what also always got him into trouble because he would lash out. So that was an important piece. And then for our learning activities, what we posed for clinicians or students, when you think about social skills intervention, what might be the best environments to generalize a skill? Pick a child that you're working with or an adolescent and identify what the environment is and how you ensure that they do that. And what other treatment goals might benefit from a social skills intervention. And then specifically related to Link, since he was going to be moving to middle school, this was going to be a huge transition. So one of the learning activities was suggesting a way to develop a transition plan for middle school. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what the case studies are all about, how they are integrated into the interventions. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions and I'm happy to answer those. So I will send it back to you, Nia.
Awesome. That was an amazing presentation. So much great information. And we did get tons of questions. So we'll just go into it, just to be conscious of everyone's time. So one of the first ones we got was, what interventions work best for a very high functioning individual with autism?
Yeah, great question. So I would say the social skills interventions, very important for kids who have more high cognitive skills. I would also say the comic strip conversations and social stories, if they're designed in the right way, can be highly useful. I think sometimes people have a different understanding of social stories and make it more like a script routine. And in fact, it's much more thought-provoking and more cognitive based. So those would probably be my 3 top for kids who have more high cognitive abilities.
Awesome. And then jumping off of that with the social stories, one attendee asked, does the book provide suggestions or templates for developing social stories specific to students' unique characteristics?
Yeah, so great. Another really good question. So there's a whole framework that Tiffany provides in her chapter that looks at here are the 10 guidelines that you should develop, and we give some examples. And we've done a lot of research in this area, so we have multiple exemplars. But one of the challenges and cautions that I recommend to the audience is what makes social stories so effective is that they're uniquely designed for the individual that you're working with autism. So you can use the book for the framework on how to develop a good social story, but you always want it to be unique. So you really want to get good information from those who know the child the best, then use the guidelines to develop the social story, but use words that are related to the student's interests, how they might talk, etc.
Awesome. So basically, if you want more information on that, the book has it for you guys. So definitely take a look at that. Great response. Another one we got was, can you tell us more about the theory of mind inventory and task battery and how we can access them?
Yeah, sure. So the theory of mind to inventory 2 is they're both online available. You can go to theoryofmindinventory.com and order it through there. It's both an online tool that you can actually you can download it if you want your families to actually fill it out by hand, but it also can be done totally online, and you get a complete report about it, and it will actually tell you what your treatment goals should be. So that's all in the computer program. And if you sign up for that, you automatically get the Theory of Mind task battery, and all you have to do is download it and utilize it. And the short and long form and manuals for it are all online. We're now working on interventions that are designed for each of the Theory of Mind elements. So you'll see it's an area called our materials room that we're continuing to develop. There is also a Theory of Mind Atlas that is free to anyone. You can download that, and it just explains what there's like 60 different theory of mind constructs, and we define each of those and what it looks like in autism, deaf and hard of hearing, and ADHD.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Another attendee asked, sometimes I feel so overwhelmed with all the areas of deficits and determining which skills to target first. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, really important question. So I always say to my students that the first thing you want to do is identify if a child or an individual has joint attention. If they don't have joint attention, that should be the absolute first intervention goal. And then you should use interventions like the Jasper model or the Early Start Denver model to develop joint attention, or the early social interaction approach and floor time. Those are all great strategies to support joint attention. That is so primary, and we can't even get to theory of mind if a child doesn't have joint attention. And you can really work on some symbolic play as well. And I think one of the challenges that people have is there are two levels of joint attention, both response to, meaning if I have a little wind-up toy and I wind it up for you and a child looks at it, they're responding to my initiation. That's a little easier for kids with autism, but it develops for neurotypical kids between 8 months and 12 months. Initiation of joint attention is a little harder, where this is where a child points to something that they see and they want you to recognize and acknowledge that. And that develops in neurotypical kids 12 to 18 months, and we oftentimes in 3 and 4-year-old kids with autism still don't see it. So joint attention, #1 goal.
Awesome. So many great questions. Let's see. Another one about the book. Does the book go through strategies for capturing Genogram and Ego Map data or interpreting it?
Yeah, great. Another good question. Yes, we do talk about genograms and ego maps in the in the larger book, not the case studies, but in each case study, you will see the genogram and ego map, and we required that all of the authors paid attention to that. And if you have any other questions about Genogram and Ego Map, I actually learned it from my social work colleagues. So feel free to email me and I'm happy to share some resources for you.
Awesome. I think we'll ask one more question and then we will wrap it up just to be conscious of everyone's time. Is there a specific age range you focused on when creating these case studies?
Oh, good question. Actually, we did a whole range, and in the book, we asked each of our writers to identify if this was, to give case studies in the book as well, as opposed to just the case studies in the separate supplementary book, if it was appropriate for younger children, school-age children, adolescents, and adults. So there are some examples for adults as well. So the age range is going to be from our youngest kids, 12 months, to young adults. So the interventions, depending on what you're looking for, like the Early Start Denver model, Jasper model would be for a younger group, social stories, and even some of the video modeling can be for older kids, and actually has shown some evidence for older kids. Some of the social skills interventions would be later. There are some social story data for some older kids. However, most of the research for individuals 22 and older is not great, but I have used some of those interventions for older individuals as long as they're appropriate content.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those great responses, and thank you everyone for submitting all of your great questions and joining us. We're going to head over to the next slide just to wrap up the presentation.
Okay.
Just a reminder, everyone who is watching this webinar live, you can download your certificate of attendance in the handouts pane located in your GoToWebinar control panel. You will also be emailed your certificate in the next 24 hours. Then the next slide.
Oops.
Reminder, you will be prompted to complete a short survey at the conclusion of the presentation. We would love to know what you thought of the webinar. And again, anyone who completes this survey will be entered to win a free copy of the book. Next slide. And then I'd also like to share that we are offering a 20% off discount on our products, including treatment of autism spectrum disorder, evidence-based intervention strategies for communication and social interactions, the second edition, through the end of the year. So anyone who watches this webinar or the recording can use the code COPY121 at checkout to receive the discount. And then if you're looking for more professional development webinar opportunities over the coming weeks, be sure to visit Brooks Publishing's website for the latest additions to our Coffee Chat series. For additional support, you can visit the link on your screen. On this page, you'll find a collection of recommended reading, downloadable resources, professional development webinars from Brooks and other leading organizations. And then one last reminder, everyone watching this live, be sure to download your certificate of attendance from the handouts pane, and you will also be emailed it. And then anyone who is watching this as a recording, please follow the link on your screen to access your certificate. I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate all the great questions. And Patricia, you gave an amazing presentation. I'm sure people are going to be running towards the book because you gave a lot of great detail and so many great responses. So thank you so much for spending all this time with us this afternoon.
My pleasure. And good luck to everybody, and thanks for working with our special population.
Have a great day, everyone.